Welcome back to another episode of the podcast. Rameumptom Ruminations. My name is Scott, and I'm the host. Today's episode is called Echoes of Belief. Thanks for coming back to listen to another episode of the podcast. Now, I know some of you might have worried, hey, this episode, there was no new episode that dropped Monday. Scott promised it was going to be every 2 weeks. Well, I just want to say that the release date is going to change. It's going to be Tuesdays from now on instead of Mondays. Behind the scenes, had a conversation with Bill. We talked about what days work best for this, and we settled on Tuesdays for releasing my episodes. Now, the topic that I want to discuss today is an interesting one. It's something that I've reflected on many times when I've had conversations with believers, and I have tried to grapple with it as best I know how. And it's something that I think many of us face, but we don't always contemplate, or there's not a pattern for the best way to tackle something like this. I think there's some really interesting irony to what I'm going to talk about, and I hope that you come with me on this journey and think openly about ourselves in the past and where we are now. Now, as always, my episode, the discussions that I have, my goal isn't to tear down faith. It's not to convince anyone to believe any differently. I just want to encourage a different way to come to some of these conversations that we have with our loved ones. I'm going to explore a hypothetical real quick. As many of us have had conversations with loved ones, friends, family, after deconstructing, no matter how long ago it was, when we talk to them, when that happens, which is not super common, but when there is an open dialogue, or we're having those conversations, maybe we present the biggest reason that motivated us to leave, whether that was the patriarchy or garments or the history of the church, whatever the subject was. The response that we get from the people that we're talking to, whether it's a thought-stopping technique, just have faith, or hey, milk before meat, God's ways are higher than ours. If it's a thought-stopping technique, or if it's an explanation of doctrine according to their understanding, how many of us have, while in those conversations, heard the person that we're talking to say something that we know that we have said at some point in the past, said or thought? Many of us served missions. Many of us were active in the calling to preach and do missionary work to our friends and neighbors. And we've had many of these conversations and problems presented to us, and we explain them away according to the theology and our beliefs. Now, on the flip side, we have this wild worldview shift that now we're presenting similar problems that were always presented to us as believers. And we know already what the believers' responses might be. We know what the church teaches. We know about all the thought-stopping techniques. And we sit there and we listen to them give us a response that we may have given to a non-believer in a past part of our lives. And I've talked about this thought experiment that I do sometimes that brings up this same idea. I wonder, I do this with some regularity, but I think about walking into a room and sitting down in a circle with different versions of myself, like a 10-year-old Scott, 20-year-old Scott, 30-year-old Scott, 40-year-old Scott, 50, on through however long I'm going to live, and sitting in a room and discussing with myself and seeing what things I agree or disagree with from different times in my own life. It's harder to future project what the older versions of me will say, but I know what I used to be like as a 30-year-old and a 20-year-old and a 10-year-old. Like I know the type of person I was, and I know the responses that I gave as a missionary. I know the things that I discussed early on in my religious deconstruction in my early 30s. I know the things that I used to say. And then when I discuss with believing family members and friends, and they say the same things that I used to say to other people, it gives me more compassion to the people that I'm talking to. These phrases, these responses that we hear on the other side, those of us that have left, we hear them, just have faith, or, God's ways are higher than ours, or whatever the answer is. A lot of the times those things can sound hollow or evasive to a non-believer. It's a non-answer. It stops the thinking and pushes the responsibility of deeper understanding of the faith to a later date. There's a joke that I say sometimes. I think I ripped this off from a show, and I can't remember which one. But when there's an issue that I can't deal with today, I always say, oh, that's future Scott's problem. I don't have time to handle it today, but future Scott, he's got this. I know I took that from a show, so maybe one of the listeners can let me know where I took that from, because I did not make that myself. But the passing the buck and doing a thought-stopping technique to let future Scott handle the issue later, which is something I did with my faith for a long time. I had serious questions, and I just let future Scott handle it. And that version of me did handle it in a way that a younger version of me would not have liked. Back to what I was trying to say. Those responses sound hollow. They sound lifeless. Like there's no real meaning to it. It's just an evasion of addressing the issue. And for those of us that don't believe anymore, we see those phrases for what they really are. But for a believer, it's a defense mechanism to not address an inconsistency with their faith. Now, as a personal example from my life of something that I've done this with, early on in my marriage, my wife and I went through a pretty rough experience. And I exercised my priesthood power, and nothing came of it. Declarations and promises of healings and, things, declarations through the priesthood, in the name of Jesus, that never came true. And that shook my faith in the priesthood completely, to the point where after that experience, I no longer believed that the priesthood had the power to heal or to affect change in the world. It was not something that was repeatable. It was not something that you could do. And in my head, leading up to that moment, asking for a good thing in faith, according to the scriptures, should have resulted in a yes. Now, I know there's a lot of issues with that sort of ideology that have been, explored in other places, whether a blessing comes true or not, both of them are spiritual and uplifting. Now, that was something that I just could not believe. I could not believe that God had all power and chose not to use it for the benefit of me and my loved ones. From that moment on, in my early 20s, I no longer believed that the priesthood had the power to affect change in the world around me. And I no longer gave priesthood blessings. Didn't give them to my wife or my children. I blessed them, in front of the congregations and that sort of thing. Baby blessings, that sort of thing. But not once in my entire adulthood during marriage have I ever given a priesthood blessing or blessing of healing to my children, even as a devout believer. And that was a subject that I had just kicked off for future Scott to handle, because the world that I lived in didn't line up with my theology. And so I chose subconsciously not to address it. I still believed, I was still devout follower, except I didn't let myself think about this one issue. When we're talking to loved ones and we express to them some of our frustrations or the reasons that we feel like the church as an institution is deceitful or harmful, or maybe that the historicity is wrong, or the practice of polygamy, or women in the priesthood, you name the issue, the believers in our lives are going to respond in ways that we may have responded from past versions of ourselves. I'm bringing this up to to talk about compassion for ourselves, for previous versions of ourselves, and compassion for our loved ones who still think the way that we used to. So I'm going to relate another story from my own life, and I'm going to talk about a Buddhist concept that I learned about early on in my deconstruction that changed the way that I communicate with my own spouse. As I was learning all the things and diving deep into the history of the church and the history of the Bible and the transformations of all religions, across the wide spectrum of our world, I would come home from work just like charged and ready to talk to my wife about everything. And my goal was to convince her of why our faith was wrong, and to convince her to join me in this faith deconstruction. That was what I was trying to do. So we'd put the kids to bed, we'd sit down on the couch together and talk, and I would steer the conversation towards religion. And I would say, can you believe this thing that I learned today? And then I would just talk and talk and talk. And my goal was to convince her, to prove to her that the steps I was taking were the right ones that she needed to take too. Now, part of my spiritual journey outside of the LDS faith has been learning about Buddhist philosophy and Stoic philosophy. I dabble in a lot of things, but I'm not an expert in any of them. So there was a subject that I learned about called Kurana. I'm probably mispronouncing that, but it's the idea. So Kurana roughly translates to like compassion or mercy, sometimes self-compassion. This idea of compassionate listening is listening to a person without the need to correct or control them. It's sitting with someone and accepting them for who they are right now in that conversation that you're having with them, without the need to impose your viewpoints and the way you see the world onto them. Being there with them as who they are right now. This ties right into one of the concepts of suffering, according to Buddhism, is an aspect of suffering in our life is directly tied to the way that we perceive the world and our expectations of the world. When they don't meet those expectations, we feel suffering. So, for example, in this scenario with my wife, I wanted her to leave the church with me. I thought that if I could convince her enough of how horrible church history was and how much we'd been lied to about the facts in the past of the church, that I could convince her and she could follow me down this deconstruction path. When we come to the table to another person with an expectation on who they're supposed to be and how they need to approach us or the world around us, we put an expectation, we set ourselves up for suffering. We can't control other people. So putting an expectation on them sets us up to suffer when that expectation isn't met. All people, everyone that you meet, is in a state of transition. We're always changing and learning and growing or becoming different people than we used to be. None of us, not a single person that you meet, is a static individual that won't change throughout the course of their life. And when we approach people thinking that they are static, that sets us up for pain, for misunderstanding. I had to come to terms with this idea of non-attachment, of accepting my wife for who she is and recognizing that she doesn't need to change for me to love her. And vice versa. She did the exact same thing to me. She recognized that I didn't need to be a different person than I am for her to love me. So we came to the table with this compassionate listening and this non-attachment love for each other. This recognition that we're both learning and growing and growing together. And part of this journey of love for us has been becoming a partner to the other person. I got a quote from Epictetus, and I was trying to find my copy of the Enchiridion, which is a collection. It wasn't written by him, it was written by one of his students, but it's a collection of his courses that he taught on Stoicism. So I'm trying to find the page number on this, but I don't have my copy of the book, so I'm I'm struggling here. The Enchiridion just means the manual. And I'm pretty sure this quote comes from book 5 or part 5, chapter 5, whatever you want to call it. He says, men are disturbed not by the things which happen, but by the opinions about the things. My opinions about the church have changed. I've learned about thought-stopping techniques. I've learned about the logical fallacies of faith. I've learned about the problems of history. So I'm hearing the exact same things that I've heard my whole life, but my opinions about them have changed. When I talk to a believing person and they talk about their faith and their convictions, my opinions about faith and convictions are different now than they used to be. So there's a concept of the dichotomy of control in Stoicism, and that's that we can't control others' beliefs or responses. We can't control other people. We can't control their beliefs or their responses. We can't control so much about these lives that we live, the things that happen to us. What is under our control is how we respond, how we come to the table, how we approach the world around us. What helped me with communicating with my wife and engaging with one of my dearest friends and my family is coming to the table not as a former member trying to rescue them and convince them to be different, but as a fellow human sharing the same world with someone who thinks differently than me. Now I can try to tell them my reasons for leaving, but me as a person, I'm never going to be able to convince anyone of anything. When we're talking to a loved one, a spouse or a family member, when we're talking to someone that believes still, and they're giving us their excuses for belief or their thought-stopping techniques, whatever it is that they're saying, what if instead of trying to combat them and give all the counterpoints that we can think of, what if we came to the table and said, I remember feeling that way, or I used to believe that very same thing too. And not as a segue into saying something else, but as that's the thought, that's the point. I shared that space with you at one point in time, but I don't anymore. Avoid the debate. Seek connection and mutual respect instead of trying to convince the other person of anything. One of the things that has dramatically changed in me since religious deconstruction is I don't hold anything tightly. What I mean by that is the ideas that I hold now, I recognize that they could be wrong. I don't know what I'm mistaken about until I test it and prove it to be right or wrong. I have been wrong about the way that I viewed the world. My whole concept about the world was completely wrong, and I had no idea. So now I come to the table where I hold things loosely. I try to understand as best as I can, but if new, more compelling information comes, I have to be open to that. So as many of us are in those conversations with our loved ones and we're having those disagreements, or they're saying things that we know for a fact that we have said once upon a time in our own faith transition, let's have compassion for them. Let's recognize that they are on their own journey, wherever that might lead. It could lead out, it could lead in, or somewhere else. We need to allow space for people to be who they are in the very moment that we're with them, because we're all in a constant state of change. Thanks so much for listening today. If you like what I'm doing, please consider becoming a monthly recurring donor to the podcast. Like, subscribe, rate it, review it, that sort of thing. My whole purpose of this one and these last couple of episodes is to talk about engaging with people that we love that hold views that are different than us. A faith transition is a complicated, messy thing. And we need to offer compassion to ourselves, past versions of ourselves. We need to offer compassion to our loved ones that still think the way that we used to. Connection and mutual respect, when possible, should be the goal. It shouldn't be to tear down someone's faith or make them change who they are. And I know I'm gonna mention here at the end the elephant in the room. We can't control them. We can't control how these loved ones come to the table to meet us. They may be unwilling to have a conversation of mutual respect. And that's okay too. That's their choice, and we can't force them to come to the table any different than who they are in the very moment that we're with them. And that's part of that Buddhist philosophy that I mentioned briefly, of non-attachment, where we accept the world for how it presents itself to us without an expectation on it. Maybe our loved ones will come with compassion. Maybe their goal is to have a continued loving relationship, friendship with us. But maybe the religion is too important to them, and that's a subject that can never be touched with that person. Or maybe right now isn't the time. Maybe it's in the future. Maybe they'll have a moment of a faith crisis, and they'll know that you were compassionate to them and that you could be a safe person for them in the future. Anyway, I'm just rambling at this point. I appreciate the listeners that have reached out, sent comments and messages. It means a lot to me to interact with you guys. So, wherever you find yourselves out there, going on a lovely hike in the spring, looking at some beautiful wildflowers, I hope that you have a wonderful day.